This is the story of the German Army's great bid to win the First World War in the spring of 1918 and how it failed, and why that failure amounts to an achievement that still matters today. Up to late 1917, the war was going Germany's way. Russia and Romania were out, and Germany gained vast resources in Poland and the Ukraine. The Ottomans were still in. They defeated the Allies at Gallipoli, and although they lost Baghdad and Jerusalem in 1917, there was no real danger to the heart of their empire in Anatolia. And the Italians were no longer a threat after they fell back 93 miles and lost 700,000 men at the Battle of Caporetto. The submarine campaign in the Atlantic was going well. Total sinkings of Allied shipping reached 6.2 million tons in 1917, compared to 3.9 million tons for all the war before, and the U-boat fleet grew from 133 boats to 142. And most important, for 3 years on the Western Front, the German army withstood everything the British and French sent against it in over 20 major offensives, giving ground only when it chose to, and wearing down the Allies' will for more big attacks. By early 1918, with 21 more divisions than the Allies, Germany had the edge in combat power in the West. But even staying strictly on defense, the Germans were losing nearly 100,000 men a month and replacing only a little more than half of them. And the Yanks were coming. The Americans were building a 4 million man army, and soon enough, the advantage in men would shift to the Allies. The German High Command knew they had to do something decisive soon to force the Allies to settle for peace on acceptable terms. But their sense of a suitable peace was shaped by two numbers. The victory in 1870 was a demanding precedent for Germany's leaders. Back then, Germany defeated the French army, captured the French emperor, got Alsace-Lorraine, and was paid reparations. This is a picture of Bismarck and Napoleon III, no doubt discussing terms. For Germany to accept less in 1918 would be a grave humiliation. And 1.3 million German soldiers had died already in this war. To settle for peace on unfavorable terms would be a terrible betrayal of their sacrifice. The German plan was for a war-ending blow where the Allies were the weakest, against the British. As a senior planner said in October 1917, "Beyond all doubt, our toughest and most stubborn, but at the same time our clumsiest opponent, is the Englishman. And next spring, in my opinion, the most dangerous one will again be the Frenchman, tested in war, more skillful, and reinforced by the Americans." The British Army got half its supplies from ports at Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne, which were very close to the front lines. And almost all its supplies went through the railheads at Hazebrouck and Amiens, which were also very close to the front lines. The British concentrated to protect their supplies. The divisions in the 2nd, 1st, and 3rd Armies held tight fronts of about 3 kilometers each, with bands of trenches and strongpoints up to 10 kilometers deep. But to the south, in the 5th Army, the divisions were spread out over 6 kilometers of front each, and the defenses there were not done in depth. So the Germans planned to attack in the south, to land a blow big enough to force Britain out of the war by, at best, breaking its army in battle, or at least forcing it to retreat toward the Channel ports. The Germans made special preparations for their attack against the British. They formed 56 attack divisions, filled them with young men from the recruit camps and other divisions, and gave them special training in assault tactics. The Germans used horses to haul supplies and move artillery. Each German division needed 4,600 of them. In early 1918, there was a shortage of 46,000 horses army-wide. but by taking them from other divisions, the German command made sure the attack divisions got their full amount. Divisions left with older men and the least horses were called trench divisions. But there was a problem the German army had to solve if its plan was to have any chance for success. At Artois and the Champagne in 1915, at Verdun and the Somme in 1916, at the Aisne and in Flanders in 1917, no one on either side in the war had been able to force a breakthrough. Millions of men died in costly battles that barely gained any ground at all. No one had found a way for the infantry to overcome the terrible killing power of modern rifles, machine guns, and cannons. To see why, picture a German platoon attacking a British squad late in 1914. A German infantry platoon had 4 squads, each with 16 riflemen and a squad leader and a platoon commander. In the attack, the platoon used a formation designed to control the riflemen and concentrate their firepower. The squads lined up side by side in 2 ranks, with the men standing almost shoulder to shoulder. The squad leaders were in the rear to keep men from falling back under fire. The platoon commander was off to the side where he could set the pace of the advance. It was an old formation. It would have been familiar to Alexander in Persia or Bonaparte in Prussia, and even Lee in Virginia. But in 1914, a platoon formed that way and moving over open ground was a perfect target for enemy artillery firing high explosive shells from far behind the lines, and for soldiers with rifles that could shoot 30 rounds a minute out to 500 meters, and for machine guns that could fire 500 rounds a minute out to 2,000 meters. In the attack, the German platoon forms under cover in some woods. In a shallow trench behind a strand or 2 of barbed wire, there are 12 British riflemen and a machine gun. The Germans begin with an artillery attack, and then their infantry advances at a walk to keep everyone together. The British strike back with their artillery. British riflemen open fire at 500 meters and keep firing as the Germans move toward them. When the Germans get near the trench, the British machine gun, aimed to fire down the length of the attacking formation, where its field of fire is packed with targets, joins in. And the German attack disintegrates. Results like that forced troop commanders all over the German army to work out better ways to attack. The first change was to give attacking troops better weapons. In 1915, the Germans came out with a new grenade called a stick grenade, and they gave them to ordinary infantry soldiers in large amounts. Grenades were much better than rifles for close fighting in trenches and from shell hole to shell hole. A soldier with grenades did not have to expose himself to shoot into a dugout or around a corner in a trench. With a grenade, he could keep behind cover and still clear the enemy away. Here's a German officer's account of a grenade fight for a stretch of British trench. I tossed a hand grenade in front of the first lot, bringing them up short, and after them all the others. Then they were stuck in a frightful jam. Hand grenades flew through the air like snowballs. Lightnings flashed between the huddled British, hurling up rags of flesh and uniforms and helmets. There were mingled cries of rage and fear. The Germans started making lighter machine guns in 1916, and by the end of the year, most infantry platoons had one. No wonder. It had the firepower of 33 riflemen. It had 3 uses in the attack. Keep defenders' heads down in their trench so the grenade men could close in to finish them off. Counter the fire of an enemy machine gun so the rest of the platoon could advance. Or break up an enemy counterattack moving over open ground against a trench just taken. The Germans began using flamethrowers early in 1915. They were for frightening defenders out of strong positions or burning alive the defenders inside them. Here is one British soldier's account of a German flamethrower in use. When the nozzles were lighted, they threw out a roaring, hissing flame 20 or 30 feet long, swelling at the end to an oily rose 6 feet in diameter. Under the protection of these hideous weapons, the enemy surrounded the advanced pillbox, stormed it, and killed the garrison. Trench mortars were lightweight artillery. A crew of 6 could manhandle one through a trench or across open ground to keep up with an infantry attack. They played much the same role as light machine guns, kill troops in the open, or force them to stop shooting and take shelter. The next big change was to attack formations. Attacking German troops started to spread out. Instead of moving shoulder to shoulder, they kept 5 to 10 meters apart in rough, staggered lines that made them much smaller targets for artillery, machine gun, and rifle fire. And they began to use cover. Whenever they could, troops in the attack moved along low-lying ground, from shell hole to shell hole, and through empty trenches. They were in the open and exposed to fire as little as possible, ideally only for the last few meters, when they rushed into the enemy trench and started to fight their way along it, something they called rolling it up. The new weapons and tactics called for a new infantry platoon. By 1916, it looked like this. There were 3 squads, a rifle squad with 8 men and a squad leader, all armed with rifles, a machine gun squad with a man armed with a light machine gun, 2 ammunition carriers, 4 riflemen to protect the gunner and a squad leader, an assault squad, also called a storm troop, with 5 men specially trained in clearing trenches and attacking strong points, 3 men with the same training but armed only with hand grenades, and a squad leader. The squad leaders were non-commissioned officers who received special training in tactics. The platoon commander was an officer. For tough fights, a flamethrower team or a trench mortar squad often joined in. Here's an example of a German assault at Verdun early in 1916. A German platoon forms in its trenches with an assault squad, a light machine gun squad, a rifle squad, a flamethrower team, and a trench mortar squad. A French squad is across the way in deep trenches and a strong point with a light machine gun in a covered concrete fighting position called a pillbox. The Germans begin with a day-long artillery attack to tear up the enemy's trench and barbed wire. When the artillery fire ends, the assault squad moves up to the trench, enters it, and clears it. The flamethrower team follows close behind. The trench mortar fires against the strong point to cover them. The light machine gun squad comes next, and it moves to block the connecting trench where a French counterattack is most likely to come from. The rifle squad follows them to hold the rest of the trench. The flamethrower team and the assault squad take the strong point. And then the mortar squad moves up to the captured trench, where it can defend against a French counterattack or help continue the German attack. The last big change in German tactics was to push the attack deep into the enemy's position. Fighting in Russia and Italy in 1917 showed the Germans that fast, deep attacks confused enemy commanders and frightened enemy troops. That meant moving as far into the enemy's defenses as possible, as fast as possible, passing by strong resistance and leaving it to follow on troops to overcome. It meant not waiting for units on either side to keep up, but counting on follow-on troops to protect the flanks of the attack from an enemy counterstroke. A German attack was no longer massed ranks of men moving at the enemy shoulder to shoulder over open ground. Now, It was a swarm of squads spread out across the battlefield, moving from cover to cover, working around enemy strong points, heading deep behind the enemy's front lines. To fight on its own through the enemy front lines and deep into the enemy rear, a squad needed as much firepower as it could get. So the Germans gave each squad its own light machine gun, and by early 1918, a German platoon looked like this. A squad had a squad leader and a 6-man assault team with a mix of riflemen and grenade men, and a 4-man light machine gun team. 3 squads and a platoon leader made up an entire platoon. All these changes were the results of the hard lessons of war, but they were refined over time by deliberate experiment and spread through the Army with command support. Early in 1915, Army headquarters assigned a general staff officer to gather new ideas, test them, and spread the good ones. He set up an experimental assault unit called a Storm Detachment under the leadership of Captain Willy Rohr. During the year, Rohr joined the new weapons and formations into a whole new way to attack. Erich Ludendorff, in effect the commander of the German army, saw the war-winning potential of assault tactics and ordered more assault battalions to be formed and to train soldiers from throughout the army. By the start of 1918, he made assault tactics official for all infantry attacks. For all these improvements, no infantry attack of any size could succeed without support from artillery. Over the course of the war on the Western Front, artillery in the attack had come to be used as a tool to batter a way into the enemy's trenches and beat down his counterattacking artillery fire. Attackers massed huge groups of guns and fired them for days before sending the infantry into the assault. A German colonel named George Bruckmüller came up with a better way. He used artillery to strike, not batter. His attacks began with a short, sharp blow at the enemy's command posts and telephone systems. Next came a heavy stroke against the enemy artillery. Then came a thorough working over of the enemy's infantry, ending with a very intense bombardment of the forward defenses. The whole attack lasted 4 to 6 hours. The artillery's last task was to throw a line of fire across the battlefield ahead of the attacking infantry. This barrage moved forward at 100 to 200 meters every 2 to 4 minutes, with the infantry following close behind. Fired on a schedule because there was no better way for the infantry to control them, these rolling barrages often outran the infantry when the enemy fought harder than the attackers planned, and sometimes they even slowed fast-moving infantry attacks down. Here's a German attack on a British battalion in 1918. The German trenches are at the bottom of the slide. The British front lines have platoon strong points about 300 meters apart. Behind that, there are company strong points in a battle zone about 2,000 meters deep. There's a line of trenches at the back of the battle zone, manned by another company. The Germans begin with an artillery attack. Here's how one British officer described one. The earth shuddered under the avalanche of missiles, leapt skywards in dust and tumult. Even above the din screamed the fierce crescendo of approaching shells, ear-splitting crashes as they burst. All the time, the dull thud, thud, thud of detonations and drum fire. The dugouts rocked. Covered by a rolling barrage, the German infantry begins their attack. The assault teams work their way through what's left of the British wire. Squads and platoons, reinforced with flamethrower teams, move past the frontline strong points and assault them from behind. Platoons and companies, reinforced with heavy machine guns, trench mortars, and even small cannons called infantry guns, assault the big strong points in the battle zone from behind. Other companies pass by the British strong points, pushing as far beyond the battle zone as they can. A British private described it this way: I see the wide waste of the shell-churned soil, the tattered wire, and well over a dark and far-flung line of gray-clad stormers. Behind them, others rising fast, apparently springing from the drab earth in knots and groups, spreading out, surging forward. The German offensive began on March 21, 1918, with an attack on the southern part of the British line. The Germans had 50 attack divisions and 17 trench divisions for a total of 67. The British had 42 divisions, 36 up in the front lines and 6 behind in reserve. The British expected the German attack, but when it came, it was overwhelming. The Germans used 6,500 cannon and 3,500 mortars to fire 1.2 million shells in a little less than 6 hours. It was the greatest artillery attack ever up to that time. It could be heard in London, 160 miles away. The stormtroopers came next, and by nightfall they had taken all of the British front line and in some places had gone deep into the British battle zone. In 16 days of fighting, the German attack reached as far as 65 kilometers into the British position. The Germans lost fewer men than the Allies. On the Western Front, no big attack had ever gone so far at so little cost. But the Germans' March offensive, named Operation Michael, failed. Reinforced by the French, the British blunted the German attack, and the farther the Germans got from their original lines, the weaker their attacks became. Past the British front lines, moving forward 5 to 10 kilometers in a day, the Germans could not make the carefully prepared artillery and infantry attacks that were so powerful at the outset. The Germans tried again against the British in April, and then against the French in May, June, and July. They made big gains, but they did not compel the Allies to end the war. All told, the Germans had 690,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and they lost 70,000 horses. The Allies lost 863,000 men. But those were losses the Allies could afford, and the Germans could not. Short of their best fighting men and horses for mobility, with weak defenses along the 170 kilometers of new front lines they had just taken, the Germans could not hold back the Allied counterattacks that began in July and kept on until the war ended in November. The 1918 offensive cost the Germans fewer casualties than they caused the Allies. That was extraordinary. Usually, the attackers suffered more than the defenders, as was true in the big British and French attacks of 1917. Even though they were a strategic failure, the German attacks in 1918 were a stunning tactical success. They were striking not just for their great gains in territory, but also for their low losses. The German way of attacking was incredibly efficient. The German offensives of 1918 gave birth to the Blitzkrieg, moving fast, making deep attacks, heedless of threats from the flanks, to confuse and frighten the enemy rather than attack his main force directly, was something that generals who would be Germany's Panzer leaders in World War II learned in 1918, not later. It's hard to understate how much warfare changed between 1914 and 1918. Artillery, air power, armor, transport were all radically different by the end of the war. But the biggest change was to the infantry. For the better part of 2,000 years, infantrymen, Greek hoplites, Spanish pikemen, or British riflemen fought standing in the open, shoulder to shoulder, acting strictly on someone else's orders. But the German stormtrooper of 1918 was not like any infantryman who ever fought before. He moved with stealth, fought from cover, and made his own decisions in combat. He was the first modern infantryman. His legacy has lasted. 50 years after the great offensives of 1918, American soldiers in Vietnam fought much the way he did. And 100 years after, American soldiers in Afghanistan still fought that way, as they do today.